Hello and welcome back to the Trauma-Informed SLP. What's up? Also neurodivergent. That's a me. I'm a neurodivergent brain, so welcome here. If you like your science weird, this is the place, baby. Let's go. This is my video wherein I am going to propose something that I actually proposed at the American Speech Language Hearing Association. They do an annual convention, and last year's was in Boston, and I did a presentation where I kind of went off on this topic, and I think it's a good thing that I've thought a lot about, and I want to put it out into the world as seeing something. If the autistic community would like to adopt these terms, please do so. Please do so, because I think we need to do this. Which is basically this. So when people talk about autistics, and really ADHDers also, or just neurodivergence in general, quite frankly, it's like the, how do you solve a problem like neurodivergency? Just like the how to solve a problem like Maria. A lot of people talk about like, what's the problem with autistics? How do you solve a problem like autistics? And it's like, you know what? Autistics are like, maybe we're not actually a problem to solve. Maybe we're just different. Can everybody just back off, please? Right? And so then debates occur and it's all blah, 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 and whatever. And everybody gets a bug up their butt about things. And I follow a lot of late diagnosed adult autistics online. In fact, like shout out to Yosemite Sam because her ADHD autism video is what led me to thinking I probably do have both myself actually. Because I am a little bit weirder than just an ADHDer. Not that you want to minimize that because it's plenty. But yes, I do feel slightly weird and I feel like I don't quite fit into either category very well, but I do have a lot of overlaps with both categories and I have a formal diagnosis of ADHD. So there is that, but I might do a whole separate video on that jazz because it's still my own personal journey. And especially given my field and everything, I don't want to co-opt a term that doesn't belong to me. I'm doing the neurodivergent overthinking about it. That's what's happening right now. I'm currently still in the overthinking process of it. So anyway, but within that, when I watch adult autistics, especially late diagnosed autistics, on pretty much every channel, at some point, that person, that advocate who's putting themselves out there is saying like, this is my experience and this is relevant and maybe this will help people understand autistics and maybe people will stop thinking we're a problem to solve like Maria and we're actually just different and they'll respect us for our differences, which is always the ongoing challenge for so many humans on this planet. But nonetheless, there's usually a video where they come out with a response to comments, typically, about how they're not autistic enough, or they're not really autistic, or they're stealing the voice from people with more severe autism. And I have had issues with how we talk about autistics for a long time now. Being an SLP, being a speech language pathologist who works with autistic clients and has worked with them for nearly a decade now, because this is a career change for me. So I came into this career. But, when I came into the field, we were still using functioning labels. So there was still the high functioning or the low functioning, which is horrible because it's like super dehumanizing if you think about it. Like if you call a human being low functioning as a human being, like that's really, okay. So humans are only really humans if we function at a certain ability level, which is not great, right? Not okay. So there's been a lot of advocacy and a lot of people are now shifting away from functioning labels because they've gotten enough. I think autistics really like, yas, autistic community for being like persistent enough. It's kind of funny, actually. Neurotypicals don't really like our perseveration and our persistence on things. But gosh darn it if it doesn't work out pretty well for the neurodivergency movement, doesn't it? Neurodivergent movement is like, yeah, well, this is, now it's my special interest. So now, boom, I'm going to info dump all I want. You can't stop me. It's kind of awesome, actually, really, when you think about it. So anyway, functioning labels, super dehumanizing. And I never really liked them as a speech language pathologist because one of my biggest issues with those terms is I started noticing pretty soon after I got out of graduate school, whenever someone on like an assessment team at a school or a teacher or whoever, whenever they say low functioning, they almost always meant non-speaking. which drove me crazy because it's a big, like, it's a spread effect thing where people assume if somebody can't talk with their mouth whole, that somehow their brain doesn't work. And I made this little quip about it kind of spontaneously at the ASHA convention in Boston, where I said, it sure is a pity that when people get laryngitis and lose their voice, they are no longer able to think. That's got to be tough. Whew! What a shame that there's a direct link between mouth and thought, such that if you're sick here, this is also sick, obviously. Like, it makes no sense. But that's a very common bias people have toward non-speakers. They just assume they can't think. They assume they're non-thinking, which always drove me crazy because it's like, that doesn't mean they're low functioning. There were so many kids I saw who were so smart, but they weren't speaking with their mouth, but then they got treated like they were so bored in school, guys. They were so bored. They were so bored in their class. And then the teacher would be like, well, they're really wiggly and they don't really listen. And they're, they have all these behavioral things. And I'm like, they're bored out of their skull because they're super smart. And you're just assuming they can't think because they can't talk. And you need to change how you're assessing thought, essentially. But, this was, I would say it more professionally, but that would be like in my head. I'm just like, you know what I mean? Flames on the side of my face. Okay. So now what a lot of people have switched to, instead of functioning, they talk about support needs, high support needs or low support needs. And this is pretty good in a sense. I think it's great when you're talking about individuals to talk about their individual support needs. I think it's great. Like if I talk about support needs I would need if I go back into the workforce, I think that would be great. I think it's a fantastic discussion. I still have a little issue with it though, because one thing, once again, as an SLP, one of the things I've noticed is when people say high support needs, guess who they're actually talking about? Yeah, that's right, non-speakers. They're usually lumping non-speakers into high support needs. So it's the same issue. It's the same issue of people have a bias. They have a pre-assumed, they've already assumed what they think this person's cognitive abilities are, what they assume this person's able to think. And it drives me the crazy, okay? It just drives me nuts. And I think also with the DSM, right? The DSM has like the levels of autism, like that's where people get into the severity, where it's like types, like type 1, type 2, type 3. I think it's 3 types. And it's the same issue with like support needs. Like the thought is if you're type 3, you have higher support needs. It's essentially the same sort of scale. And honestly, quite frankly, it's just a lateral move from functioning labels when people are talking about the groups of people who fall into these different categories. And my issue with this, the core problem I have with this, is that these sort of terms and these labels that we use to talk about groups of people, so we have a very diverse, complex group full of very diverse, complex individuals, and then we lump them into like a couple of categories where we're really just talking about how caregivers or providers for care perceive the autistics. That's essentially what people are talking about. It's always still rooted in what the experts or caregivers see and what they perceive as being the issue, the problem to solve, right? The Maria of the situation, if you will. And that's pretty much what we're talking about, right? So here's what I propose, okay? And adult autistic advocates out there, feel free to look at this and let me know if you want to start using these categories, because I think this hopefully will reframe the discussion, because that's what we need. We need to pivot and remarket and reframe the discussion around support levels and functioning labels. No, if we're going to group people, especially if we're going to take a diverse spectrum of neurodivergence and group them into different categories, I propose we develop categories that focus on the societal experiences of barriers to access, barriers to equity, and barriers to inclusion. So essentially, we're focusing on systemic societal barriers. We're focusing on the things that make the social model of disability very relevant to autistics, ADHDers, late adult diagnosed neurodivergence, autistics, like adult diagnosed, okay? Here's what I say. Based within this like social model of disability, while also considering the medical needs of the community, I propose we talk about apparent neurodivergence and non-apparent neurodivergence. These are not concrete categories. A person can maybe be very apparent neurodivergent as a little kid. Maybe they have really high sensory needs or real struggle with regulation, but as they grow into an adult or a teenager even, they're able to kind of regulate and calm their body, and so they become more non-apparent. Maybe someone who is more non-apparent when they're younger becomes more apparent the more that they unmask and the more that they like advocate for their needs. Or maybe just as they get older and stuff happens and they have like acquired stuff happening like brain injuries and stuff, and now they're more apparent for that reason. Speaking for myself, not to brag, but I've had some mild brain injuries. Yeah. Okay. So if we talk about apparent, now this is the term I use instead of visible disability, I use the term apparent. I just like that term a lot better. I'll link the website where I've read about it and learned about it. But apparent being there is a tell, essentially. If you're thinking of it as like poker, does this person have a disability? It's like people with apparent disabilities, apparent neurodivergence, they have some sort of tell. You either can tell by looking at them due to like the way their muscles coordinate. Maybe they struggle to walk around. Maybe they struggle to sit upright in a chair. Maybe they need a they need a speech generating device because the muscles in their mouth, or maybe they have selective mutism, which is also poorly labeled. Situational mutism is what I would say, because we can just keep the same acronym. Maybe they have that, but they have something that tells you, this person is different. They clearly have a disability. They have a visual or an auditory tell that something's different about them. That's an apparent neurodivergent. Non-apparent neurodivergence are the ones who do not have that same tell. So you might not immediately recognize that they have a neurodivergency. Now, if I walk around with my earplugs in, which I've been doing a lot at conferences and stuff these days, I've probably automatically become a bit more apparent to people, because they'll be like, what's up with that? Why has she got earplugs in? And it's like, okay. Unless they assume they're earbuds, then I don't look apparent at all. But because people walk around with earbuds all the time anyway. But, right? So that makes somebody more apparent versus non-apparent, okay? So you can definitely, like I said, they're not concrete. You can move in them. But late diagnosed autistics, people who are diagnosed autistic and or ADHD later in life, I would say very likely fit into the non-apparent category, at least at the time of their diagnosis. There's a reason why they got missed, essentially, in childhood. And maybe they were misdiagnosed with something else, like anxiety disorder, or maybe they were misdiagnosed with like oppositional defiant, whatever, the ODD disorder thing. I hate that diagnosis. I'll have to do a separate video on that. I'm not even a mental health specialist, but I really hate that diagnosis. So maybe I'll unpack that some other time. But nonetheless, maybe they received a different diagnosis, possibly due to either their gender presentation or their race and ethnicity, because that definitely affects diagnosis rates. In fact, if you notice, a lot of advocates out there are white, and that probably belies a lot of bias in the whole diagnostic process. But I digress. Let's get back to that later. I just want to acknowledge that right then. So that's the non-apparent and then the apparent, okay? Let's apply these terms now to autistic experiences or ADHD experiences in society. And this is all based in a lot of reading I've done over the last couple of years. So if it's not my own experience, I've read about firsthand accounts and all this other stuff to kind of come up with these categories. But here's the thing. When you think about an apparent neurodivergent, an apparent autistic, okay, you are talking about people who are very highly stigmatized in society, right? Like when a kid sees someone who needs help with moving around or their body moves differently, the parent might be like, oh, shh, don't stare at them, or, oh, don't ask them about that, right? Like they get kind of like, shh, don't talk about it. It's very rude, right? Historically, apparent neurodivergents have had a lot of social isolation. In fact, to the point of being, typically these would be the autistics who were put in institutions back when we had asylums. All right. They got placed away from society where no one saw them. Okay. Didn't mean they didn't exist. It just meant nobody actually really saw them. We just removed them from society. So we don't have to deal with the discomfort of the stigma of removing humans from our sight. And nowadays, a lot of times, even within like the United States, a lot of these more apparent autistics, apparent neurodivergents, are going to be placed in self-contained classrooms where they have access to high support needs, right? So they don't really get as integrated into the general education classroom. So still, people grow up through the school, and if you're in more of a general education classroom or you're outside of that self-contained classroom, basically, you're not around these people very much. You don't see them as often, right? So there's still kind of that stigma of like, they are different from us, they're separate, they're over there, okay? That's an apparent neurodivergent. Another issue that's strongly faced by apparent neurodivergents is they are denied access to necessary supports to achieve a certain level of independence. So they're either not presumed competent, like it's presumed that, oh, they won't be able to use that high-tech device to communicate, so we shouldn't get them that device, right? Or it's that they can't speak, therefore they can't talk. Spread effect is what that's called, where you see someone struggle with something and you assume it affects some other aspect of them that has nothing to do with it, actually. It doesn't have a connection. And they often get infantilized. There can be a learned helplessness aspect to that. And this learned helplessness, I think it really does come from this lack of presuming competence by caregivers. And then also this infantilization, and it just contributes to this heightened dependency on the caregivers, because what learned helplessness really is essentially when someone is forced to bear a situation because they essentially have no power to get out of it. And to be very clear, learned helplessness is a direct result of societal oppression and stigma. It's not like it's an inherent part of having a disability. It's something that's put upon them by really not being given any choice due to caregivers' assumptions and the stigma around what people think they are capable of doing, essentially. And the other thing about apparent neurodivergence, where I think the debate really rages, is that they have more overtly, meaning obvious, costly support needs. So there's an obvious cost to supplying mobility aids, to supplying speech generating devices, to supplying perhaps 24/7 caregiver support if they need that level of help, if they need someone around to help them go to the bathroom and clean and feed themselves and all of that, right? And in the United States, I mean, I don't know if you guys know about this, but our health system doesn't really want to pay for things, It's like a thing that happens in the US health system. So, insurance might not want to pay, right? And how is a parent? Oh, yes. And that also includes very much a lack of extremely needed support to parents/caregivers/guardians who are the primary caregiver, particularly if this neurodivergent is still a small child. Most of the time when I have met families, one of the parents had to essentially train to become the nurse for their own child, basically, or the nursing assistant for their own child to get paid to be a 24/7 caregiver, because they can't work a job and take care of their child at the same time because there's not enough support and there's not enough monetary support. And the system will not provide a caregiver just because you're going to go work. Like, that's not a thing that tends to happen. So, which is just, yeah, it's kind of absurd that that's how that goes. Also, we don't support them with mental health needs, with their own emotional support needs, because it's very difficult being a caregiver for someone with like really complex medical needs. I can't even imagine how stressful and exhausting and the emotional burden of that, along with the physical. I can't imagine either of them. And we don't really give them time or space or support for that. So shout out to those parents who are those caregivers, to the guardians who are those caregivers. And also, like, that is a big issue. We need to support them better. The system needs to provide more supports to them. And also, quite frankly, in the United States, we don't have a good answer for those parents. If someone has a lot of complex medical needs, and let's say even into adulthood, they're always going to need 24/7 care, there was not a lot of good answers of what happens to them if something happens to their primary guardian at the time, right? If something happens to that caregiver, what happens to the child? We don't have really, the answers are there, but they're not great. They're not very comforting. I'll put it that way. And even as the child grows into an adult, where do they go if they can't live with them by themselves? Our answers, we have answers. They're not super comforting answers usually in most places. So that's definitely an issue that I think often gets neglected in discussions. And I think that's where we get this like headbutting between people who say, oh, you're stealing the voice of these non-apparent, these non-speaking autistics, or what about non-speaking autistics? Everybody always wants to know, what about non-speaking autistics? And it's like, okay, first off, non-speaking doesn't mean they can't function independently. Let's get that on the board. But for folks who have more complex medical needs, there are a lot of systemic issues there that really need to be addressed. And I think caregiver support is a really big part of that. They need access to more help for sure, for themselves. Okay. So I'm going to throw that out there. All right. Let's switch over to non-apparent neurodivergence and the type of systemic societal stuff you tend to face as a non-apparent neurodivergent. Okay. So if you're non-apparent, you likely are a speaker like me. I'm speaking, right? Some of this comes from my own experience, but also corroborated. Is that the word I'm looking for? Not collaborated, corroborated. Gosh, I can't say that today. Okay. Likely corroborated with the experiences of other non-apparent autistics or non-apparent neurodivergents. So we're the ones who are able to mask. So we experience a lot of that mental health, the negative impacts of masking, feeling like we need to hide ourselves. It usually shows up because as children, we're initially kind of allowed to hang out with friends and to be in a friend group, but then we experience social isolation and rejection when we are considered too weird or whatever. So we get bullying, we get teasing from peers and sometimes also adults, classroom teachers even, right? So we learn to mask, to try to fit in and try to be safe, right? So we hopefully save ourselves from that bullying and that teasing if we can mask successfully enough, okay? Typically for us, there's a huge denial of disability. So people will say, you're not actually disabled, you're not actually neurodivergent, you're not actually autistic, right? There can be a real denial of the needs for accommodations and supports due to the assumptions that like, oh, you just want that because you're lazy, right? You don't actually need it. You just want to get away with stuff because you're lazy, right? Because they don't see our struggle. Our struggle is not as apparent. So they assume we're neurotypicals who just want an easy way out. There's a lot of shaming narrative from adults and peers in terms of being lazy, getting away with cheating. That translates to a lot of internalized ableism, feeling like we're not good enough. And we try and burn ourselves out trying to fit in and still failing. So we just set ourselves up for failure. And that definitely does not help our mental health at all, right? A lot of implicit biases can lead to a lot of social difficulties and miscommunications with like bosses and teachers and employers and colleagues. Like we can have a lot of butting heads with people professionally even because we don't realize we're coming across a certain way and they misinterpret our own communication. Or we just miss like somebody's being really passive aggressive. And like, I've done that 1,001 times. I miss it. I don't realize they're being passive aggressive. I don't realize that colleague is upset with me. And then it becomes this huge issue later. And it feels like it comes out of nowhere to me because I wasn't aware of the signs beforehand because they were all passive aggressive signs and I missed it, you know? And then, like, if we look for advice on ways to improve ourselves, a lot of times our weaknesses are the things that are constantly emphasized. So, like, people just kind of look at you and they're like, just change this and that and this and that. And like, there's a huge list of stuff to change, right? And nobody really mentions our strengths very often, which leads to us not even really being aware we have strengths most of the time. And especially for people who are assigned female at birth or people who are BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, the neurodivergent status might likely be missed until later in life. And so they receive a late diagnosis, and that's when they start to learn that they can actually try to seek accommodations, and they hit these denial of disability barriers. Bam. So when we look at this, when we look at apparent neurodivergence and non-apparent neurodivergence, apparent neurodivergents are never given an option to mask because the disability, something about either the visual status of like their movement, their mobility, or there's a hearing component of like whether they're a non-speaker or not, they're not usually given the option to mask, right? People immediately assume things, like they assume they're disabled immediately. And then non-apparent neurodivergents are given an option to mask. We could mask because we're initially accepted until it's determined we're not good enough or too lazy or too weird and we're kicked out, okay? So while there can be some similarities, there are a lot of different experiences with systemic barriers, systemic and individual barriers to access and inclusion and equity, okay? So non-apparent neurodivergence and apparent neurodivergence have different support needs very often at different stages of life, and they have different advocacy needs at certain points in life. I hope that makes sense. So what this all means is that if you're listening to non-apparent, aka able to mask, late diagnosed adult autistics, they are going to be talking about their own life experiences when it comes to the barriers that they've experienced and the discrimination and the biases that they've experienced. They'll likely still be denied that because this is the internet where humans is going to be human and people who want to deny it are going to deny it. That's a thing, but they're going to talk about their support needs and the advocacy they need to do, right? And the things they wish they had when they were younger, for example. But it's all through the lens of their own experiences as non-apparent neurodivergence. It does not mean that it's less or less important or less valid than the barriers faced by apparent neurodivergence, by non-speakers and people who have mobility aids and things like that. So the systemic barriers are different, but we don't have to go that extra step that everybody seems to always want to go and say one has to be worse than the other. That's not necessarily the case, okay? Because just because something's not obvious, like the mental health impacts of being a non-apparent neurodivergent can be incredibly significant, and you really can't say 100%. No one can actually tell an individual non-apparent neurodivergent that their mental health struggle is somehow not as severe as accessibility struggles for an apparent neurodivergent, if that makes sense. Or even the mental health impacts of being an apparent neurodivergent. It can be the same. The struggle can be the same, okay? I have a few other side notes here that maybe I can't think of a good transition here, I guess, but let's just go for it. In the United States, and I personally suspect in other countries, this is my opinion, okay, this is just stating an opinion for the purpose of education, but I think because the system atrociously neglects caregiver needs, so mental health supports, time off of being a caregiver, humane answers to what happens to them if something happens to me, right? What you end up with is a group of isolated and neglected people who are overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and quite frankly, it makes for fairly easy targets for, organizations that promise to fix or cure it, So I think the answer is not fixing or curing anything, it's improving the system so that we recognize that caregivers are part of it as well, and that we provide them the support they need as well as the support the child and or more apparent neurodivergent adult needs. That's what I think the answer is. So We don't need to focus on a fix or a cure. We need to focus on respecting the differences, breaking down the systemic barriers, and also supporting the caregivers for people who have significant medical needs and significant medical support and need that caregiver there all the time. Let's provide support for them too, and maybe produce better answers for what happens to the child if something happens to them. Maybe have a much nicer answer. The other thing I would say to people who say, but the speaker autistics, including myself, you're taking away time and voicing from the non-speakers or the high support needs, right? What I would say to that is there are some absolutely amazing apparent neurodivergent advocates who are out there, particularly non-speaking autistics. The autistic advocates who are able to mask are not stealing any space or time or words from those people. They are out there. The difference is a lot of people don't seek them out. They don't follow their channel. They don't follow them on the social medias. They don't read the articles they wrote. They don't often get listened to. And in fact, people still debate oftentimes whether or not they're actually saying their own words or whether somebody else just put those words into their mouth, because sometimes what they have to say is kind of uncomfortable to hear. And it can be pretty easy to just dismiss it as like, that's probably not them actually saying it, because people assume non-speaking equals non-thinking, which is just a bias, right? So essentially they continue to be ignored thanks to our societal stigma, our dehumanization, the bias that exists in the science about them, all of that stuff, right? So for people who say non-apparent autistics kind of talk over the more apparent or those with more significant medical needs, I have to ask, like, how many non-speaking autistics do you follow? How many people do you know? How many articles have you read? And if the answer is none, I really encourage you to sit back and think for yourself, like, why is that? Why did I not know about that? And the answer is likely bias and discrimination. That's why. And it's not your fault. It's just that's the world we live in. And those are nobody really promotes those people as much. You know what I mean? Personally, I think it's time to change that. So I'm going to put a list to people you can start following down below. There's actually Neuroclastic has a really great list of non-speaking autistic advocates. So I'll probably just post to that list more specifically and then include, I think there's a couple of others out there that I don't think they included on their list. So I might throw them on there. All right. So if we're going to talk about autism and autistics and ADHDers as a giant group, and we're going to try to classify people into two discrete categories, I propose we classify it by the types of systemic societal barriers that are faced, the types of discrimination that is experienced by people in those groups. And I think using apparent versus non-apparent is a great start for that. Do I think it's the ideal? I'm not sure, but I just sort of came up with this on my own after a lot of research. And so if other people have other ideas of how to break that down and how to label it and how to talk about it, let me know, please. And I will adopt a much better idea. Because like I said, I'm not the best at naming things, but let's stop using categories that essentially is really just focused on the problem with Maria. Okay, let's not solve the problem of Maria. Let's just accept and respect Maria, just like in The Sound of Music, when the Captain Von Trapp was like, hey, I'm going to marry the nanny because it's Julie Andrews and she's dope. That's probably what he was thinking. I know they were actually real people. That's just... But I also know that the real story in the musical is very, very different in story. So in the sense of the musical basically being a fictionalized account, I think we can successfully say that, yes, that Captain Von Trapp was probably like, oh, I have a choice between Julie Andrews or this other Baroness lady who, quite frankly, was fairly dope, but also fairly selfish. Makes sense to go with Julie Andrews. Sure, why not? I would probably go with Julie Andrews in that case, too. Let me know your thoughts on this and what you think. And in conclusion, any late adult diagnosed autistic and or ADHD and or any other type of neurodivergent out there, you are valid. Your experiences are valid. Your voice matters. keep doing what you're doing. Okay, there's always going to be people who deny our disability, but just because they don't see our meltdowns doesn't mean we're not having them. Just because they don't see our anxiety attacks doesn't mean they're not having them. We're not having them. Just because they don't see our struggles doesn't mean they don't exist. And the more people who talk about it, the better, in my opinion. And you're not stealing voices or time from the truly apparent neurodivergents who are out there. There are advocates out there. The people who say you're stealing time are very unlikely to be the people who want to listen to what those advocates have to say. That's what I think anyway. And maybe that's not concrete and completely true, but I think there are a fair number of people who, if they knew about those advocates and they read what they say and they listened to their voices, they would likely deny what they're saying because they would probably be uncomfortable with it. Okay. That was my opinion. Let me know what you think. If you found this helpful, like, comment, subscribe, blah, 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 blops. And as always, let us all reclaim our weirdness by keeping it weird.